All right, so we are getting the Facebook Live set up, and as soon as it is ready to go, then we will get started. Seems like it is ready. So I am Andy Ellis. This is the first episode of Green Space, my new politics podcast, in which we're going to talk about independent politics, community control, social justice, ecological wisdom, and some other of the values that have animated me to do the work with the Green Party over the last couple of years. Tonight is our first episode, and we have Dayvon Love, Director of Public Policy of Leaders of a Beautiful Struggle. Dayvon is a national champion debater and author of several books and a fierce advocate for policies that come out of the Leaders of a Beautiful Struggle. So Dayvon, why don't you tell us a little bit about yourself and about Leaders of a Beautiful Struggle?
All right. Well, first of all, thanks for having me, Andy. It's always a pleasure to be in dialogue with you. It's we've known each other a long time, so it's just good to reflect and, kind of see where we are now.
Yeah.
So I am Dayvon Love. I'm Director of Public Policy at Leaders of a Beautiful Struggle. We are a grassroots political think tank that advocates on policies that impact Black people in Baltimore and the state of Maryland. We focused a lot on criminal justice as an organization, but we've also kind of expanded to other areas, civic life. So we focused on, and a lot of our work ends up being legislative advocacy in the state level. We find that a lot of the policies that impact Black people in Baltimore and around the state are state level issues. And so, that's kind of just a big, broad overview of the work at LBS.
Fair enough. And so recently you published an article called The Colonization of Radical Politics. I think that this is an interesting piece that talks about the role of white folks and Black freedom struggles, but also talks about the role of Black freedom struggles advocating for public policy around policing. Can you tell me a little bit about the thesis of that piece, and we'll dive into it for a bit?
Absolutely. So that piece was actually inspired by So one of the things that I think tends to happen when they're in kind of general political commentary is that there are often forces that animate the stuff on the surface that doesn't get the due attention that it deserves. And when you study history, the history of social movements, particularly as it relates to Black people, there's certain dynamics that just become obvious, right? When you do rigorous study. And one of the things that I tend to find is that there really aren't, in the kind of public intellectual activist mainstream, I don't find there to be a tremendous amount of rigor in the analysis of the political history, particularly as it relates to Black social movements. And so I happen to just observe in the midst of the, social unrest, several weeks ago, and then some of the activity that I observed here in Baltimore, I just observed dynamics that, as I understand it, are pretty easy to predict, right? But there wasn't, from my perspective, enough conversation about it. And one of those dynamics is the way in which I think that they're in some social justice spaces that are centered around issues that impact Black people. I think there are times when there's kind of an over celebration or just or too congratulatory of a perspective in white folks being involved in issues that impact Black people. Most people see it as like just a necessarily good thing, right? White people recognizing, their privilege and structural racism. And so in part, what I attempt to lay out in the piece is the way, particularly in the 20th century, right? The end of the 19th century and the beginning of the 20th century through the 21st century, what I say with the fundamental thesis is white folks exercise an extraordinary amount of control, both over, in many cases, the historiography and the institutional formations of certain of Black social movements in ways that aren't talked about explicitly. And that, in fact, particularly through the 20th century, you see white folks having a whole lot of influence over which social movements or activities are deemed mainstream, which ones are given legitimacy. And the ones that white folks tend to be most willing to give legitimacy to are social movements and political discourses that de-emphasize the importance of Black self-determination, like institutional and political self-determination, and often elevate folks who put forward solutions that the institutional solution ends up being Black folks' continued dependence on institutions that we don't control or operate.
Let's dive into that a little bit. So let's talk about a practical example, not from the last couple of weeks, but from that period in history that you're talking about. Can you isolate something that helps bring this theory into practice?
Yep. So, and I'll give an example that's not in the article, but I think will be in the piece that I wrote, but I think will be helpful. So when you look at the turn of the 20th century and you look at the formation of the NAACP, right? Many of the founders were white, right? That put out a call and invited Black folks to participate in the formation of the NAACP. And in the early activity of the NAACP, it focused a lot on anti-lynching advocacy, right? And support from a note that lynching, in addition to it just being generally an act of terror against Black people, that in many respects was kind of an economic piece to it, where any Black person that exercised any economic autonomy, particularly in the South, lynchings were used to discourage that. So that was the crux of the NAACP's work. And what emerged parallel to it at the time was the UNIA, the Universal Negro Improvement Association, led by Marcus Garvey, the biggest mass movement of peoples of African descent in the United States ever in recorded history. So then there was actually a time when they were collaborating. A woman, Megan Francis Ming, she wrote an article called Movement Capture, where she looks through the minutes of the meetings of the NAACP and finds that there was a shift in direction that took place in the NAACP from its early inception to the 1930s and 40s. And that shift was away from anti-lynching advocacy and towards education desegregation. And that shift came as a result of a major funder who wanted a white funder from a major philanthropic institution, I think it was the Garland Fund, that wanted them to start focusing on education desegregation work instead of anti-lynching. And this actually put the NAACP and the UNIA, among other things, but this is one of the things that made them be at odds with each other. And so I use that as an example to say that most people don't know that. And most people, and you don't hear a lot of conversation about the way in which the board of directors of the NAACP were influenced by the philanthropic sector, right? White funders, right? That wanted the NAACP to focus on something that they felt better. They felt better about advocating around education desegregation instead of going after anti-lynching.
So I think that's interesting, because I think a lot of times when you get into these discussions, people say, no, did you know that there were white folks who were fundamental to the founding of the NAACP, and cite that as a virtue for that organization. So how would the world have been different going forward? Looking back and going forward, how would the world have been different had UNIA emerged as the leading movement coming out of that era, instead of NAACP capturing some of the energy of UNIA?
So that's a great question, and I think many of the things that we've seen since that function from the perspective of Pan-Africanism or Black self-determination, much of it you can give remnants of UNIA. So, for instance, the Nation of Islam, which was really helped to incubate Malcolm X. Elijah Muhammad, was affiliated with Garvey. Malcolm X's parents were Garveyites. And so when you look at the vision so if we take Malcolm, right, Malcolm X, and we use the vision that he put forward, we would have Black people would have institutions for our political, social, economic, and military defense and ability to advance our interests, we'd be able to engage in multiracial coalitions from a position of strength. I think that, and so I think even when you put it in the context of an issue like policing, I mean, the conversation just would be different. I think part of the problem is the kind of historiography that we're socialized into, and like Black folks are socialized into, which is part of the common American socialization, is that Black folks got freedom by petitioning white folks for their sympathy. And I think that is there's no people in recorded history that would make the point that, or would think that it's a legitimate approach to get their freedom by petitioning for the sympathy of those that are oppressing them. And so I think, so that's really what UNIA had to offer as a methodology. And it's unfortunate because that approach is understood in this moment to be radical, to be, not inviting of, working together.
Yeah, and let's come forward to this moment. So in the course of this year, we've gone from rally around the flag, celebrate the first responders, we're all in this together rhetoric, to George Floyd, to a movement for defunding the police that has taken over in a short period of time. So how does that theory that you developed in the article and that we just laid out and that historical example help us to understand what is going on right now, where even people who had never heard of abolition are now, sharing links about helpful articles to teach your neighbors about abolition or something like that,
Yeah. So there's a lot there. So let's start with a couple of conceptual pieces.
Yep.
One is that the American mainstream has an animus towards a political animus toward conversations centered on Black self-determination, right? So, some of us call it Black nationalism, other of us call it Pan-Africanism or Pan-African nationalism. You will not see in the public mainstream a rendering of that political ideology in a way that affirms it as a legitimate political option. And in many cases, it's either ridiculed or made a caricature of. That's important because then what gets filled in its place are iterations of Black freedom struggle that do most of the time one of two things. Again, as I mentioned earlier, they're either petitioning white folks for their sympathy on the basis of the spectacles of Black suffering, right? So, and so that's why over the past several years, we've had all these images of Black people dying as the basis for many of the movements that have sparked, social, conversation and social unrest, because people are appealing to that kind of moral piece. So there's that. And then the other thing that gets lifted up is this notion of even folks that substantively are dealing with the question of racism or white supremacy from a structural perspective, the end political objective is ultimately this idea of everybody being able to come together, right, and share mutual, political social interests. So the reason that I lay those things out in the beginning is because we get to our current moment. The conversations are the lens from which these conversations are understood is through this lens of Black people are suffering, that's bad, and we should sympathize. And this, if we all sympathize with Black people suffering, we can come together and all be one. And so what has happened is then there are a bunch of things that have emerged, in a lot of these, these popular conversations. So that's where you get a lot of the demonstrations. That's where you get, Don Lemon on CNN talking about, people need to speak up, and celebrities, becomes a mainstream thing. And the question that folks should ask themselves is that in a white supremacist society where mainstream media is operated as a engine of the American empire and white supremacy, what does it mean that those discourses are now more mainstream, right? Does it mean that America is getting it and that we're turning the corner. That's one approach that I think some people are taking. I would make the argument that there is a massive co-optation happening of radical social movements, that the mainstreaming of things like racial equity, the mainstreaming of issues on police brutality are being absorbed into the mainstream. And a part of what's happening is conversations about, again, if we're talking about policing, conversations about what is necessary to address the issue of police brutality are being lost with approaches that deal more with like interpersonal conversations with police officers. Lastly, to the point you made about, so this piece about abolition, part of the issue with abolition, as I think that language is being co-opted into the mainstream, I think a part of what's happening is that on one hand, abolition is being understood kind of in this broad sense of the police are bad, we need to do away with police. Now, it's important for people to know that the Western world, as it relates to policing and prisons, is extreme when you compare it to other civilizations that have existed, highly advanced civilizations that have existed. If we're going to talk about abolition, right, we have to talk about the different ways in which non-Western societies have organized themselves in order to not need police. And so the conversation about defunding is emerging from the political context that I described earlier. And a part of what I would hope that your viewers would take heed to is that while the call for abolition and defunding is going towards something that I think objectively is something that any human civilization should move towards, which is abolition of the kind of inherent violence of policing, that has to be accompanied by really studying, again, non-Western societies, right, both historical and contemporaneous, studying those in order to build an alternative future that allows us to construct a world where police don't exist because of how we've looked at how other folks have done it, non-Western societies have done it.
So if we can, so I think everybody should be able to agree that moving away from the violent policing structure that we have now should be a goal, right? Like, I don't think that there's anybody who's going to be watching this who is affirming that the violent white supremacist policing structure we have now should stay in place. So what are some of the things that people can take away? So what I hear you saying is sort of we've moved too quickly without doing the work necessary to get to this point. So what is some work that people can take away and go do that are listening?
So a couple of things. One is that really take the time to familiarize yourself with the variety of existing organizational efforts that are addressing issues of violence. Because what you'll find, and a part of the value of the conversation about defund police, is that looking for folks who are doing innovative things that need to be funded. So that's one thing, it's just familiarizing yourself with those things. Secondly, as I mentioned, studying non-Western societies. And I make it a point to say that a lot because, one criticism I have even of other, Black organizations and activists in the conversation about abolition and defund is that there isn't enough rigorous study of the political economy of non-Western societies to develop alternatives that are tangible that people could see as viable alternatives. So
and too often we end up saying Minneapolis did this, Detroit did this, Chicago. We contain it entirely within a U.S. framework and assume that we can only escape it by looking at what some city or town did. Exactly.
And I'm gonna give an example of the worst version of what you just talked about. I remember when the unrest began, when folks were talking about abolishing police, and they used Camden, New Jersey as an example. And what people don't recognize is that, they abolished one police department, got a neighboring police department to assume the responsibility of police in Camden, New Jersey. And so it went back to the same policing structure that it had prior to abolishing the previous one. And I even saw an article about a week or so ago that was like, oops, yeah, that's actually not an abolitionist,
Right.
like oops, And so so yeah, I think so certainly to that point, we have to look at non-Western societies. And then the last thing that I would also say is that I think it's important to really spend the time when you're looking at dealing with the issue of what folks can do, is that one of the things that makes this work hard is the way that labor law is used as a shield for addressing the issue of policing. And labor has often been a partner, a kind of a quiet partner with the Fraternal Order of Police. And they're going to be spewing propaganda in ways that in their propaganda assume the necessity of police as a construct. So I just think it's going to be very important, for your viewers to be very vigilant about that rhetoric that is used, that comes from their partners in labor, folks that are supposed to be friends of the left, being very vigilant about the propaganda that gets put forward that makes the idea of abolition seem ridiculous.
And I think the other thing that I've been thinking about recently is that abolition has to come from community control of policing and a remaking of the structures that we have. It can't simply come because folks appeal to the city and the city says, okay, cool, we're good. All right. Skipping over that important step of building alternative institutions that are able to provide a different sense of public safety probably does feed into the FOP's argument about what the world would look like if we just got rid of the police tomorrow. So
exactly.
I want to get back to the labor point, and when we talk about the specific reforms that you think need to occur, but I also want to talk about community control for a little while and understand the importance of building the power to have democratic community control over the police, what that looks like in reality and on day one, and how we use it to move toward an alternative system. So share your thoughts on community control, and we'll go from there.
So community control is a concept that it's complicated, it's complex. And it's important for people to acknowledge that it's complex, because I've seen, for instance, in Maryland, and I know particularly in Baltimore, you have institutions that people describe as like community schools. And all community schools really means is a school with a nonprofit attached to it. That doesn't constitute a community school. So, but when people say, well, what exactly is it? Acknowledging the complexity of it, because at the core of community control are the mechanisms necessary for the community that's being served to exercise control over the institution. And again, that's complicated. If you think about it operationally, for instance, community control doesn't necessarily mean that the community votes on every single aspect of an institution, right? Because that's operationally not, feasible. But it certainly doesn't mean that one person decides everything for the community, right? One thing to point your viewers to is in Harold Cruz's Crisis of the Negro Intellectual. He actually talks about this notion of a new institutionalism. It's the best version that I've come across in terms of really capturing what community control is. And what he says is that part of the problem, and he's writing about the 1920s, 30s, 40s, and 50s Harlem. And one of the things that he says is that there's been too much doctrineering as it relates to what constitutes community control. So, he was particularly critiquing, the communists who would say at the time, everything has to be publicly owned. And what he was saying is that, well, what publicly owned means is the state really community control? And so when he says do institutionalism, he says, look, each community has to think about what combination of publicly controlled, privately controlled, cooperatively owned, whatever combination of institutions that serve the needs of that community, that give it the ability to ultimately control the institution in a way that's operational. And I think that so what he says is that one of those things individually won't get us there. And so what that means about community control is community control requires the community to have the time and space to build the infrastructure that best suits it. And a part of the problem we have today is that there isn't enough investment because democratic institutions require resources to build the infrastructure for the practice of democracy.
Yeah, because otherwise they just default to the people that have the resources, or are able to, philanthropically fund the resources.
Exactly. And that's important because that's what's been happening, is that people with resources have been able to characterize to the public what is the community controlled institutions. And then when people push back and say that's not the community, folks say, well, then what is it? And it's like, well, we don't have the resources to construct the alternative, right? So it gives the status quo an advantage over characterizing what community is. And so I think, so that's one of the things that I would say, just from an advocacy perspective, one of the things that would really help is for people to call for greater investment in infrastructure, building in communities, so that communities have the resources to create the time and space to build, like what mechanism. So when conflicts arise, it would be nice to have the infrastructure for it to be folks' job to deal with conflicts in the neighborhood. But because of the lack of infrastructure, that often is, pawned out to an entity that the community doesn't control, which is, in many cases been the police, right? And so it's a part of why investment in infrastructure is an essential ingredient to community control.
And what does that investment in infrastructure look like? Right now, it looks like politicians and philanthropists allocating money that they get to control to people in communities to run organizations that seem to assert that they are the community. What does the new state look like where those resources are coming in control of the community, and how do we get that power wrested away from the people who are gatekeeping that right now and put into the hands of democratically controlled institutions?
So there isn't like a perfect manual for doing it. I think the compass conceptually that folks should use, there are pre-existing networks of people working to build stuff in the community. Mm-hmm. And there's some networks that are more connected to philanthropy and to the government and other folks who are less connected. And so really, when we talk about investing in infrastructure, it's really about investing in organizations in different formations for whom can demonstrate a level of commitment and accountability to Black people that traditionally are not folks that people organize with and on behalf of. So a part of what I mean by that is that in this kind of new age of social media and people being kind of social justice warriors, it's easy for people to get elevated and have a lot of visibility, and oftentimes people confuse that and even the things they caricaturize as community, like a person who's like loud and aggressive and passionate. So the things that people use as caricatures for what community is, and then if they're really visible, they're community. And I really encourage people to interrogate that and really think more about the substantive things about a formation or organization, which is, what are the nature of the folks that support them? Mm-hmm. Are the folks that support them people whom aren't very visible, right? Do they have credibility amongst sectors in the community that don't have a lot of apparent political influence or power? Are they supported by people that are not adjacent to major white corporate institutions? So I think those are just conceptually are just some of the things that folks should try to think about as they advocate for this idea of investing in infrastructure.
So one of the things that I think that I hear some people raise as a point when you start talking about community control and devolving power down to community is that is sort of a line that goes, that's great for Black communities, but are we devolving power to white communities in order, does the same model mean that we're giving white communities control over their community? And is that safe for Black folks in their community? And my answer to that is usually that's the status quo.
Exactly. That's
What we do now. But there are some levels of protection in place for some Black folks in there. And the Black folks, people of color, people of all sorts of different diversities there. Is there something about, is there a risk in devolving control away from state government, politicians, philanthropy, that we empower sort of the worst parts of white community?
I mean, to the point you made, I think that's the status quo.
Mm-hmm.
I think the current institutional arrangement is such that much of that, not only does it currently happen, but Black folks are in a position where we don't have the requisite levels of defense against what said formations might do to Black people. So at the very least, in what I'm describing, resources are put into the hands of Black folks who are most equipped to engage in defending us from whatever harm would come from a formation that would emerge in the way that you described.
Yeah, and my sort of feeling on this is we shouldn't let the fear of an existing white power structure stop us from investing in Black community control of the Black community, because that is the status quo. And if we allow that fear to say, to be a reason to keep the status quo in Black communities, we're not doing anybody any favors in that regard. I think that's an interesting point, and it is, because oftentimes I hear the community control argument articulated as community control of the police for Black communities. And that seems like a sort of half step to me when, the original Panther call for community control of the police sort of acknowledged that there would be a white part of Berkeley that would have control over their police. There would be a student part, a wealthy white part, and a Black and Latino poor part. And I think that we shouldn't stray from that original conception as it has sort of entered the public mainstream in order to try to do something that feels very 21st century, which is to say, community control, but just for Black folks. Right. And to me, that misses the point of the status quo we have.
Yeah. I mean, the only thing I would add to that is that that a part of, and I hope this doesn't take us off track, but a part of what I think is important, and you and I have talked a little bit about this, when you talk about advocacy as it relates to Black people, there are moments when I think there's a paternalism that is accompanied with things that relate to Black people that I actually think is ultimately more harm than good. And there are some Black people that will put forward kind of a set of paternalistic ideas and approaches to dealing with Black people that white folks consent to. And and I think so to the question, this piece around like community control, like I'm not afraid of white people in a world where I have the things I need to defend myself. And I don't, to the extent that white folks have power is to the extent that Black people are not organized to exercise our own.
Mm-hmm.
So white folks shouldn't bend over backwards in this regard, trying to like not hurt Black people, as opposed to, do what in any other situation would be pretty rational, which is people should control the stuff that governs their lives.
Yeah, and I remember a couple of years ago, we were talking about culturally relevant pedagogy as a factor of law that should be, in place. And the question comes up in that conversation too, and it sort of is, if Black folks get to have culturally relevant pedagogy, then don't white folks in the suburbs get to have that? And I remember your answer at the time sort of being like, sure, I don't care, right? And I think that helps me to frame this question in a way that is like, yeah, okay, like let's not be afraid of what democratizing our institutions looks like. out of sort of some false benevolence that keeps a system in place that doesn't work.
Right.
So,
And I mean, a part of, and for me, it's like, yeah, education should be informed by culture, right?
right.
And there are things for white people to learn about themselves. Because I think a part of the underlying premise in people's anxiety about that is that there are no elements of the history of white folks in the West challenging white supremacy that's substantial enough to form a curriculum around.
Yeah.
And to me, it's like just do that. That would be great for white people and everybody else.
Yep. And so I want to transition to the conversation about politics, but there's a question first, and I want to see what your response on that is. So it says, for our reading list, what would you recommend for white folks wanting to learn more about the non-Western political formations you're referring to?
So I'll give a few. I'll run down a few. So you could start with Intro to African Civilizations by John G. Jackson. So you could start there. You could do Gerald Massey's Anacalypsis, which is a really big, thick book. You can look at Civilization or Barbarism by Sheikh Anta Diop. If you Google Civilization or Barbarism and you put the book tab, it'll come up. You can look at Intro to African Studies, which is it was written by both John G. Jackson and Willis Nathaniel Huggins. So those are just kind of a few. Those are a few that I can think of off the top of my head.
And if you send more, I'll put them on the page, and people can check them out that way. So I want to take a moment to transition here. So this is a politics show, and in May, you said perhaps one of the most controversial things I've seen you say, at least in social media terms, in a while, which was that you weren't voting for Joe Biden, and that you, as a Black Democrat in Maryland, weren't voting for Joe Biden. And gave some reasons, and it blew up into hundreds of comments, and some folks, I think, really didn't understand what you were saying, suggested that you were supporting Trump, and suggested that we have to vote for Joe Biden this time around. So I want you to break down that, both your idea and the reaction to it, a little bit, and then I want to get into that for a bit.
Yep. So when I think about politics, I think about it in terms of what will deliver material improvements to the quality of life of Black people. So for me, for Dayvon, that's the lens that I look at politics. That lens, when I use that lens, and I start with that because I think there's some folks that when they hear versions of the argument that I make, they attach it to people who are not thinking specifically about engaging in political activity to achieve to improve the material conditions of anybody, in the near term. As I use that lens as an analysis, as I use that lens, what occurs to me is that in Maryland, and it's important for me. One of the things that I said in the eventual Facebook Live I did, it's important for people to be clear. Your vote means something different in different states. In Maryland is a Democratic Party stronghold, right? And so, we have a Republican governor who in some contexts, some places in the United States could be characterized as a moderate Democrat, right? And so in a Democratic Party supermajority state where Democrats are going to win the Electoral College, the Democratic nominee for president is going to win the Maryland electoral votes. That's just the reality. And so as a result of that being the case, my thought was, okay, how can I most effectively use my vote to basically hold the Democratic Party more accountable to the people it says is its base? And so the National Democratic Party giving us Joe Biden, to me, is a signal of the Democratic Party as an institution, which has a bunch of organs, right? So Democratic Party is a bunch of stuff, but as an institution, it shows me its values. And so in a very, very small way, in voting, either leaving it blank or voting for, a green, which I've done. I've never voted for a Democrat for president, and I've never had to. Most of I voted green or left it blank. I think in 2012 I left it blank. I think in 08 and 16 I voted for a green. And for me, and for me wanting other people to do the same is a signal to the Democratic Party that if you don't move towards the left, then you're going to lose people that they may need politically for other things they need. Even when folks who are running for office are looking at the data, the Democratic Party uses Van, right? One of the major softwares they use for campaigning. And if they look and see, oh snap, all these people voted green who typically were Democrats, that impacts their calculus, that impacts how they feel like they have to appeal to those voters. And so to me, it's what makes having the Green Party in Maryland significant, because it gives me an option, knowing that the Greens are likely not going to win any of these major elections, right? But it gives me an option to say, I'm communicating to the party and to just political operatives in the state, this is where we are. This is where we actually are. And if you want to get us, then you got to move in this direction.
Yeah, and so I think that's a really good framing of it. Last week, Margaret Flowers and I did a discussion on this about why voters in Maryland should vote green. And I think the point you make about Hogan is really interesting, because if you look, Hogan is almost the mirror image of Trump to voters in Maryland. And if you look at Hogan's favorability ratings and Trump's favorability ratings, they're almost the exact opposite of each other. So while Hogan is in the high 60s at points, Trump is in the high 20s. And so it is, the fact that we have Larry Hogan is not an indication that the state is in play and that somehow like this year could be different. I mean, the pathway for the Democratic nominee not to have won Maryland this year was if Bernie Sanders had won the nomination and the DNC had sort of shadow backed some billionaire who could have been a centrist. That's the only way that we would have seen Maryland not, if Michael Bloomberg had been backed as an independent against Bernie Sanders, we might have seen Maryland go to Michael Bloomberg, but there's no way it would have gone to Trump. Right. And so one of the things that I noted when you said this is that there were people that said, but Dayvon, you lead an advocacy organization, and lots of people have really paid attention to you and built up energy around you. What if your voice is enough to sway the state and enough people vote green in order to cause Joe Biden to lose to Trump?
So that, and see, that's the result of the propaganda that Democrats want people to believe. See, I believe that Democrats go out of their way to not be vigilant about giving voters an understanding of the machinery of electoral politics and party politics.
Yeah.
And for a variety of reasons. One that's kind of different but related, even when you look at voter registration. Like the Democratic Party doesn't do mass voter registrations because that messes up the math for the kinds of folks they want the party to have at its helm. But even to this point, this piece around, like me not voting for Biden, like on cable network television and even some local, news, it's like, yeah, we got to get Trump out. There's no way that anything that I could do, like, and I believe in myself. Right. But I know that there's no way that anything I do was going to impact enough votes in Maryland that it could go Trump.
Yep. And I mean, the interesting thing, like Joe Biden is going to win Maryland by 800,000 votes. And every single Bernie voter from the 2016 primary could vote for the Green this time around the Green would have an outstanding showing that changed politics in Maryland forever, allowed the next legislative session to be the most progressive ever, and Joe Biden would still win by 500,000 votes.
Exactly.
Right.
Exactly.
And so, I mean, the notion that somehow advocating for utilizing your power is going to have an adverse effect on you in this case is to me the only effective messaging that the National Democratic Party has had in the last 4 years since Trump is this one message is don't, if you vote for anybody but Joe Biden, you risk 4 more years of Trump. And we've talked about some really serious issues so far tonight. We've talked about policing, we've talked about community control, we've talked about access to resources. And the national level Democratic Party that runs presidential candidates has no interest in addressing those things. And so I guess the question I have is, do you think at a local level where, you know, one other point I'll make about this, if you live in a swing state, saying that you're not voting for Joe Biden may get Joe Biden to engage on policy issues that you care about. That's not a power we have in Maryland because Joe Biden knows that the state is not voting for anybody but him. Right. So you could,
I mean, do we even get commercial? Like, we don't get campaign commercials. Like, when I travel sometimes, I sometimes forget that there are places where there are political campaign ads. I don't see it.
Totally. I was in Florida in February and there are Trump ads, there's Bloomberg ads, and I was like, oh, hey, this is what it's like to live in a different place. And I mean, to me, it's about recognizing your power and not your powerlessness, and to finding a way to make your vote count for something. So how does voting for Joe Biden or voting for a Green or at the presidential level or at the mayoral level or at the city council level shape the power dynamic in order to be able to have the policies that you want? Can you give an example of when not voting for a Democrat got something done?
So the example I'll give is that, so if we look at the 2016 mayoral election, so that was a pretty interesting election for Baltimore City locally, because I would describe the city council members prior to that are folks from which the corporate sector had a pretty strong hold on. 2016, a bunch of folks on the city council got elected who are not folks who are corporate folks. Many of them connected to nonprofits and philanthropy, but many of them, their politics are more progressive. There was a brother who ran as a Green for Mayor, Joshua Harris. And, you know, and I voted for Joshua in the general. And the reason that I voted for him in the general is not because I thought he'd win, but I voted for him because I thought that if enough people voted Green in that election, it would be a signal politically to the council people that there's a strong contingent of people whose politics lean Green. And so he got like 10,000 votes, which I think was the most that a Green has gotten in a mayoral contest.
You get 10%, you got 20,000 votes.
Right, 10%, that's right, 20,000 votes. So you got 10%, you know, which is extraordinary for a Green in a city like Baltimore. And so this council has been the most progressive, as a person who does legislative advocacy, having to, you know, essentially advocate to these folks. This is the most progressive council that I've seen. And again, I think that came because there were other options. And as they're looking around, I think they see, okay, that's the direction that a lot of people are going. So that's a direction that I want to go.
And the other thing I think is that just as on a personal level, no Democrat in a place where Democrats have won every election for 50 years wants to be the first one to lose one, right? And so no Democrat is sitting there saying, you know, I'd really like to be the person who got knocked off for my council seat by a Green. And so I think they're willing to move on these things. And, you know, to me, I think I long ago stopped doing this primarily because I believe that we're going to have, you know, a small minority of people on the council this year. right? I think that that's a 10-year goal, and I think we need to build the movement power in order to have there be alternative voices in Baltimore City. And it may not be the Green Party by the time that it's 2032 and somebody is in office. It may be, it may not be. And for me, my belief is that we have to do the work in order to build the institutional basis so that people can run outside of the Democratic Party structure and have that effect. There's way more people that vote in general elections than vote in primary elections. And, Josh's number at 20,000 votes, that's a huge number of votes. And if we had gone back to an election like 2011, where we were on an off-year cycle, that's an amount of votes that would have made him competitive. And I think most of the people that voted for him voted enthusiastically for him. I don't think that there's many people who sort of half-heartedly vote for a Green. I think there are a lot of people who vote for a Democrat because they're familiar with it, especially in general elections in Baltimore. And I mean, I don't want to overemphasize that point. I think people make decisions on purpose. I think most voters are informed. But there is an enthusiasm that goes into having to go and pull your ballot for a Green that I think is different and is a signal. I think that people know that there is a possibility out there that the right candidate could knock somebody off someday. And I think that keeps people honest and allows the opportunity to push policy that wouldn't otherwise be pushed. Ryan Dorsey introduced a bill the other day to ban gas stations that came out of conversations that the Green Party had at the Sustainability Commission. Does Ryan think he's going to lose to a Green? Probably not, but it probably doesn't hurt him to go and do something and basically introduce legislation that is in the Green platform.
Right. And I think what you're describing is the point that I was trying to get to kind of in some of the stuff that you did, that I talked about earlier a few weeks ago, which is that it is actually this position that actually has the best ability to impact the material conditions of Black people. It's actually more concrete. Some people relegate it to like this, they're not going to win. It's moral purity. And what you just laid out to me is the point that I was making, which is, no, this is for those of us that actually want to get policy that's going to impact us positively now. This is actually an important tool to do it.
Mm-hmm. And the more votes that go against somebody in a general election because of that very clear value-oriented platform that calls for community control and calls for these type of things. One of the ways that I put it is that if the Green Party is to succeed, it has to take power away from politicians and philanthropists and put it into the hands of people. And that is a scary notion for most politicians, but an exciting notion for many voters. And if the message is continually that, it's going to push elected officials to go in that direction, because that is a popular position. People want to have power. They don't want to have decisions made for them.
That's right.
So I think that we are approaching the top of the hour, but I wanted to get, we can go past, whatever, right? Like, this time is free. There's no show coming on next, but at the same time, I want to respect people's time. I did say it was 7 to 8, but I want to hear what you think the 2021 legislative session is going to look like in general in Annapolis, but specifically around these issues of policing, which have gotten so much attention recently, and have been part of the work for a long time that some people have been doing, but is recently becoming on some people's radar. So 2021 legislative session.
It's going to be a very interesting session. If you combine the fact that last session ended early, you combine the fact that there are a bunch of vetoes. The governor vetoed a bunch of things that were important to the Democrats. Combine that with the national conversation, right, and social unrest. It's actually, for me, it's hard to predict exactly what the session's going to be like. I know myself and other organizations are going to push for the most revolutionary legislation there can be as it relates to police accountability. And I'm getting calls from pretty significant legislative forces asking me what I think, and maybe checking my temperature to see kind of how far we're going to go. But I think that it's really hard to tell. And my central concern, um, the legislature has done a good job of absorbing the progressivism that's come into its ranks. When I say absorb, I mean absorb the progressivism in a way that doesn't necessarily change the legislative outcomes at the end of the session. And so that's the thing that I'm spending a lot of my time in pre-session prep, is thinking about what are the ways that the Democratic Party are going to try to have the most, radical rhetoric on the issue, but use it as a maneuver to get past some of the more moderate stuff that the center of the party is actually more comfortable with.
So what to the degree you want to talk about it, what is the most revolutionary police accountability bill coming out of Annapolis look like?
So I think we'd have to repeal the LEOBR,
Mm-hmm.
the Law Enforcement Officer Bill of Rights. And for those that, freak out about that, a part of what you do in its place is that you have municipalities negotiate with the FOP, and whatever protections police get, you get it in the contract. So that's one piece. The Maryland Public Information Act amendments that would allow disciplinary records, which are currently understood to be personnel records by the law, to be available for the public to look at. Because part of the problem that we have is that officers continually do things and we can't see their file. And so those are for me like two of the most foundational pieces. And then there are other things like a use of force policy that creates kind of a statutory line for where use of force should end. It helps both in terms of internal discipline, and if you got a prosecutor officer, it just provides a clearer line that helps on both sides of the process. But I say those first two are foundational, because what the FOP and the police are trying to preserve is their ability to police themselves. And we just need to rip apart their ability to police themselves. Once they know that there are forces outside of themselves that will see what they're doing, their behaviors are going to pretty drastically change.
And what do you think about this question that keeps coming up of local control of the Baltimore City Police? Do you think that transferring power from the state agency to the city over the police force is useful, or is only as useful as the other two pieces of legislation you just mentioned, or is a waste of time? Those are sort of the range of opinions I hear on it.
So I'll say this: if that were to be the only thing to pass, that would be a travesty. Mm-hmm. I've not had anybody be able to explain to me exactly the tremendous benefits of the transfer. I mean, logically, yeah, it makes sense. We should have control of our police department.
It's better than not, right?
It's better than not, right?
Yeah.
But in terms of what it does exactly, because I've heard people describe it as giving the council the ability to make changes. Not really. The council couldn't make a policy to change the discipline policy, because that's covered in the LEOBR.
Right.
The council couldn't make a policy saying that disciplinary records of police officers should be made available to the public. That would contradict state law, so they wouldn't have the authority to legislate that. So getting local control, like you said, it's better than not having it. Yeah. But it by itself, to me, and that's a part of what I'm concerned about, I'm worried that might get pushed and peddled as the thing that gets done, and not the other things that actually will make a tremendous difference.
So the argument, to me, the argument has to be that doesn't matter until the other two things happen, right?
Exactly.
Like, right. And then once that, yes, we should have, like, it'd be better for the city council to be the voting body that gets to decide on these things than the state legislature, right? Like, sure. And so one question that I want to ask that comes out of this is, we went from a conversation of broad theoretical principles about Black and Pan-African self-determination to a very specific legislative ask. That is, to strike down a piece of labor law that governs the police and a piece of public information law. So how does your practice wind through the conversation that we've had tonight to talk about using your power effectively, to talk about putting power in communities, and also find the legislative interventions to make a difference?
So for me, politics are about being able to exercise power. And I'm clear in a society dominated by white supremacy, imperialism, colonialism, that in the current state of affairs, there's a limit to what it is I can do in the moment. So for me, a part of what I've been trained to do is you assess what do you have the ability to do now? And then are you able to build the political machinery to do more? So legislative reforms like addressing the LAOBR, these are things that are like in the meantime. Mm-hmm. So while I'm, doing the work to try to build the base, to build institutions that can be independent and alternatives that exist kind of outside of the legislative space in order for Black folks to have power. Things like the LAOBR is a particular intervention in the meantime that doesn't detract from the overall revolutionary goal. For me, my goal is African sovereignty, right, and self-determination, and in a way that resists all forms of oppression, right, that is disruptive to the imperialism and colonialism. And so, but in order to do that, you have to build stuff that gives you the power to really fight it. And so I don't feel any shame or any ideological uncomfortability by saying, in the context of where I am, what are things that I can do that can reduce some harm, right? That can deal out some immediate, benefits to Black folks while I'm building the long-term stuff in collaboration with other folks. And that's a really important point, because I think sometimes people do this kind of facile reformist revolutionary thing. And I think people have to be clear that when you're in the world actually having to do stuff, you got to accomplish stuff now, because it gives you the ability to build towards that revolutionary activity. And as long as you're clear, I'm clear that America, as Derek Bell said, is a permanently racist society. So I don't have any faith that America one day is going to not be anti-Black. But I also know that the policies of America impact Black people. And that while I'm trying to build that alternative, it's important that I can do what I can right now to reduce the harm that's done to Black people as we're building that alternative.
That is a great, I think that's probably where we're going to close off on this, but I think that's a good closing point there. Thank you, Dayvon, for being on the first episode. This will be on Facebook, and I'll make sure that that is shared. And if there's anything else you want to leave folks with, go ahead and say so now, and then otherwise we'll go ahead and end.
So again, thanks a lot, Andy. This was great. Had a good time. If you want to follow LBS, it's lbsbaltimore.com, LBS Baltimore for all your relevant social media. And again, thanks again for having me on.
All right. Thank you, Dayvon. And thank you to everybody who watched this time. It was the first time, so I'm getting used to the technology. I'm getting used to the back and forth of having conversations that I have with friends and people I know in front of other people. So I appreciate everybody who tuned in. And we will have another show next week where we will likely be interviewing George Gluck, who is a 6th District Green Party candidate in the 6th Congressional District. And so tune in next week. It will be a different show than this one, but it will also be an informative look into how somebody's politics exists as their practice. So thank you very much, Dayvon. We appreciate it. Thank you to everybody who watched, and we are signing off. Thank you.
All right.
Bye-bye.